Welcome to Anatomy and Physiology, Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology, Biology 160, finishing up our lectures on the reproductive system. We've talked about the female anatomy, we talked about the male anatomy. We're going to spend most of the rest of the time talking, focusing on the female, because although the reproductive system includes the male and the female does, I guess basically that's where most everything happens, and she basically does all the work, because she has to carry the baby and help it to develop and things like that. The male just gives the sperm, and his job is in reproduction is done. So let's look at the menstrual cycle. So this is a cycle that occurs with the endometrium. Remember, the endometrium is the inner lining of the uterus. And it is carried out. The menstrual cycle is basically a month-long cycle, usually about 28 days in length, but that can vary from female to female. But it is carried out by fluctuations in hormones, and specifically estrogen and progesterone are very important in the menstrual cycle, and then also FSH and LH, which are going to regulate the estrogen and progesterone that are produced. And so these are the four hormones that are important in the menstrual cycle. As I mentioned, the cycle can vary in length, but one thing is kept pretty constant, and that is that ovulation happens about 14 days, about halfway through the menstrual cycle. But from ovulation to the end of the cycle, from the menstruus being released, that is almost always 14 days. So, there's some stages of the menstrual cycle. There's the first part, which is called the menstrual phase, the proliferative stage, and then the secretory stage. So one menstrual cycle begins with the release of the menstruus. So here's the menstrual cycle. And this is looking at estrogens and progesterones, the rising and fall of these two hormones. So day one is when the first day of menstruation begins. And that's how they determine that first day. And you can see the blood levels of these ovarian hormones here on the y-axis. So at this point, estrogen and progesterone are pretty. And at this point, the endometrium is being sloughed off and it's being released. A female usually loses about a half a cup to a cup of blood during the menstrual. The menstrual phase lasts from typically between day 1 and day 5, and bleeding is going to be happening during this time. I think, well, I say 1 cup. 1 cup's probably a little much. Maybe half a cup would be about as much as a female would lose. So maybe between a fourth and a half cup of blood. At this point, the growing follicle is going to start stimulating the production of estrogen and producing estrogen. And so we see the estrogen starting to rise. Progesterone is still staying pretty constant. But as the estrogen rises, we call this the proliferative phase. This is from day 6 until day 14. And as the estrogen levels rise, that's going to stimulate the proliferation or the rebuilding of the endometrial layer. The blood supply is going to return. It's going to start thickening. Then day 15 to 28, after the proliferative stage, now the progesterone begins to rise. And it's going to peak here towards the middle of this stage here. And the estrogen is going to drop and then have a small rise again and then drop again. So the rising level of progesterone is going to be put out by the corpus luteum. So ovulation has happened at day 14 during the proliferative stage, and that egg is moving down the fallopian tubes. And during that time, now we have the corpus luteum that is producing the progesterone that's telling the body to get ready for implantation and pregnancy. If implantation and pregnancy do not happen, then the progesterone levels drop, the corpus luteum degenerates, the estrogen and progesterone drop significantly, and then we move back to the menstrual phase as the endometrium begins to be sloughed off again. Here's a corpus luteum and what it's going to be doing, and the follicle as well. So during the menstrual phase of this cycle, the menstrual cycle, the primary follicle is going to be growing. And then during the proliferative stage, the follicle continues to grow, and then ovulation happens on day 14 at the end of the proliferative phase. And then once that ovulation occurs, now we have the corpus luteum, which is the follicular cells that are left over, and they're actively producing progesterone. Here's what the LH and FH levels are going to look like during this phase. So LH and FH stimulate the production of the follicle, and also the release of the ovulation, the release of the egg. So you can see the LH levels stay pretty constant, then you have this big spike that signals the release, the ovulation is going on. And there's also a spike in the follicle stimulating hormone as well. And then finally, let's look at the lining of the uterus, the endometrial layer, and what's happening here. So during the menstrual phase, the endometrial layer is sloughing off, and this is where the bleeding occurs. So the endometrial layer is getting very thin. And then during the proliferative phase, as the estrogen starts to rise, the endometrium starts to enlarge, the blood vessels come back in, it starts to become thicker. And then during the secretory phase, now that the progesterone is rising as well, and the endometrium is getting ready for implantation of the fertilized egg. If implantation does not happen, progesterone and estrone drop off, and then the endometrial layer begins to slough off as well. This may be a good point to talk about birth control pills and things like that. Birth control pills are trying to affect the progesterone levels in the body. So if we go back to progesterone levels here, notice that if pregnancy happens, so this is a menstrual cycle, and so in this case, the progesterone, if fertilization doesn't happen, progesterone drops off. But if fertilization does happen, pregnancy begins, and the level of progesterone is going to stay high. And so a birth control pill, what it's doing is it's mimicking this pregnancy basically. So it's releasing progesterone into the bloodstream, and so the body thinks that fertilization and implantation have happened and pregnancy is going on, even though it hasn't. And so that's why you get no menstrual cycle. You don't have a menstrual cycle, and you don't have an ovulation either, because you're kept in this perpetual pregnancy cycle. Here's a list of the things that the hormones do. So we have estrogen. It's produced by the follicle cells. It causes secondary sex characteristics, developments of breasts, pubic hair, fat beneath the skin, widening and lightening of the pelvis, all of the things that you associate with female secondary sex characteristics. We also have progesterone. This is produced by the corpus luteum, and it continues until LH diminishes in the blood, then it's going to drop off. And it doesn't do anything with secondary sex characteristics, but it does maintain pregnancy and prepares for the birth of the baby as well. So that's how the menstrual cycle happens and what's going on there. Let's take a minute and look at the mammary glands, which are an accessory organ on the female anatomy, and their job and what they do. Both males and females have mammary glands, but only in females are they functional. And it's interesting because they're actually modified sweat glands. So they're exocrine glands, and they don't produce sweat, they produce milk, but they're very similar to sweat glands in the way that they work. The parts of the breast are here. The pectoralis muscle is behind the breast. There's connective tissue layer, and then there's adipose tissue associated with the breast as well. There's a lobe, and the lobes are internal structures that radiate around the nipple. We have the areola, which is this darker area around the nipple, and then of course the nipple. And we have the openings of the lactiferous duct. This is where the milk is produced and released. We have the lactiferous ducts where the milk is produced. And then we have alveolar glands, which produce the milk. I guess I say this a little bit better here. So alveolar glands produce the milk, which then moves to the lactiferous ducts, and the lactiferous ducts take that milk and they take it to the opening of the lactiferous duct, and that's where the milk is released so that the baby can feed. The function of the mammary gland is to produce milk, and that's its primary function, is to feed the infant after it is born. Okay, let's spend a little bit of time now and talk about pregnancy and development. So there's a few stages of pregnancy and development that are important in child growth and reproduction. The first is fertilization, which we've talked a little bit about. We'll talk a little bit more about it. There's embryonic development, there's fetal development, and then finally we get to childbirth. So let's start with fertilization. Fertilization is when the sperm cell and the egg cell come together. Remember that the sperm cell has 23 chromosomes. That's half the normal number of any other cell in the body. And then we have the egg, or the oocyte, which also has 23 chromosomes. As they come together, this makes an individual with 46 chromosomes, which is also our what we call 2N number in humans. That's a normal number of chromosomes, and through fertilization, that's how that is produced. Sperm are going to enter the female reproductive tract by way of the vagina. But from there, they have to make it clear up to the uterine tubes or the fallopian tubes in order for fertilization to happen. It's actually not a very long distance, but it does take a little bit of time for the sperm to be able to get there. But when they get to the egg, that's not good enough. Interestingly enough, in each teaspoon of semen, and a male will ejaculate between 1 and 2 teaspoons. In each teaspoon of semen, there can be anywhere from 50 million to 200 million sperm. There's a ton of sperm in the semen. An interesting thing, though, is that if you have less than 20 million sperm in the semen, then that is too few. That is probably too few to become pregnant. So you need a lot of sperm. Males do have a lot of extra sperm, but you do need a lot of sperm in order for fertilization to happen, because there are a lot of things that happen along the way to keep the sperm from getting to the egg. So the environment in the vagina is very acidic, which kills sperm. Plus, it's a long way, so if the sperm head the wrong direction, they're not going to make it there as well. And plus, when they get to the egg, that's not good enough. The egg has a protective coating around it that is there to protect the egg and keep out the sperm. And so the sperm, when they get there, they have enzymes in the tip of the sperm that are going to start breaking down that wall of the egg. Because of that, it's not necessarily the first sperm to the egg that is going to fertilize the egg. Only one sperm can fertilize the egg, but as the sperm reach the egg and they start breaking it down, they're going to break down that barrier so that a sperm that's coming behind them is most likely the one that's going to be able to break in and fertilize the egg. So you don't necessarily have to be the first sperm there in order for that to happen. As fertilization occurs, we have the formation of what is called the zygote. Z-I-G-O-T-E. The zygote is the first cell of a new human being. This is the cell that is produced when the sperm and the egg come together, sharing their 23 chromosomes each to form the 46 chromosome single cell, and that is called the zygote. The zygote is then going to start to replicate and produce more cells as the embryo grows. This process is called cleavage. So you have a fertilized egg, cleavage is going to occur, and you're going to go from 1 cell to 2 cells, and then 2 cells to 4 cells, and then you're going to move on in that way. And this is the way, and this is all carried out by the function by mitosis, which is cellular reproduction. And this is the way we go from that very first single cell that we all start as to the multi-billion celled organism that we are now. All these different cell divisions. So the zygote is first formed as the egg is moving down the female reproductive tract in the fallopian tube. As it's moving down, the sperm is going to meet that egg and is going to fertilize that egg. Then as it continues to move down the cell division is going to occur after fertilization happens. So by the time the cell reaches the uterus, it's no longer a single-celled zygote anymore. By the time the cell enters the uterus and begins to implant in the uterine wall, we already have what's called a blastocyst, which is a 100-cell. It's around 100-cell organism, or 100-cell human at that point. So cell divisions have happened a number of times, and you formed this little blastocyst that has a cavity. So you're already starting to have cells somewhat differentiating, moving to different areas of the organism. You have an outside layer of cells, and then you have this space called the blastocyst cavity, and then you have another group of cells which are going to become the inner cell mass. The inner cell mass, that is eventually what is going to develop into the human being. The rest of the cells on the outside are going to function in helping to form the placenta and other necessary parts of the growing embryo and then fetus. But the inner cell mass, those are the cells that will eventually grow into the human. So here we have our uterus. Here's our endometrium, which is the inner layer of cells in the uterus, and that's where this blastocyst is going to implant and begin development as it moves along. So now we have another couple new words. We already looked at what the zygote is, the first cell formed after fertilization. Now we also have the embryo, and this is the early developing organism, the first developing human being, and this starts until the 9th week of growth. We call this the embryo. After that, starting with the 10th week, or starting with the beginning of the 9th week, this we now call the baby a fetus. So the blastocyst is part of the embryonic stage. So the zygote is only that single cell. Once you move from that single cell to 2 cells, now you're working with an embryo as you keep continuing to move to more and more cells, clear up to the 100-cell blastocyst, and then finally in the 9th week it's going to become a fetus. As the embryo is growing, developing, some important parts are going to form. We're going to have what is called the chorionic villi, the amnion, and the umbilical cord. These are accessory organs, accessory parts of the embryo that are going to allow it to grow and develop. The chorionic villi come from the embryo, the growing embryo, but they are not going to become the organism. That's what the inner cell mass is, but they cooperate with the cells of the uterus to form the placenta. This is going to be the exchange basis between the mother, or the exchange organ between the mother and the baby as it continues to grow. We then have the amnion. This is a fluid, so the baby is suspended in a fluid-filled cavity that keeps it safe from being bumped and hurt in that way, so it can continue to grow. So it's a protective type fluid. And then we have the umbilical cord, which we've seen before, by which the baby and the mother are able to exchange nutrients and gases to allow the baby to grow. And this is what it's going to look like. This is about 18-day-old embryo. We have the parts of the embryo starting to form. These 3 terms, ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. In this earlier developing embryo, it doesn't look anything like a grown human at this point, but different cells are starting to differentiate, move to different areas, and they're going to start to be, what they're later going to become is starting to be determined. So cells that are of the ectoderm are going to become certain parts of the body, mesoderm are going to become different parts of the body, and the endoderm are going to become different parts of the body. The ectoderm is mainly going to form the nervous tissue of the growing embryo, and also the epidermis of the skin. The endoderm is going to form the muscles and the glands, and then the mesoderm basically forms everything else in the growing embryo. So those are some important parts. The placenta is another very important organ. where the exchange between the mother and embryo happens. So the placenta delivers nutrients and oxygen to the growing baby. It also removes waste from the baby as well. So the baby's enclosed within the mother's womb, and so it doesn't have outside access to nutrients or oxygen. That's where the mother comes in, and this is the job of the placenta. So the mother and the embryo don't actually exchange blood, but the blood moves in vessels next to each other. So between the placenta and the mother's circulatory system, the blood from the infant and the blood from the mother are able to exchange gases, exchange nutrients. The baby is able to get all that it needs without actually having to actually getting blood from the mother. The placenta also becomes an endocrine organ. So initially, the corpus luteum, which was formed from the follicular cells, produces estrogen progesterone to keep the pregnancy going. But by the end of the second month, the placenta now takes over the production of estrogen, progesterone, and other hormones that help maintain the pregnancy. Now, by the time you get to the beginning of the 9th week and the embryo is now called a fetus, all the organ systems are formed, and they're now just going to grow and develop. This is pretty amazing that after just this 9-week period, we have all these complex organ systems in their, at least in their beginning stages. And so now the baby is going to grow and change, and it's going to start to look like a human, but in a younger form. And so we've got our developing fetus. You can see all the features. You can see the toes, the fingers, the developing facial features. The genital organs are going to become apparent, so you can tell the sex of the baby as well. So these are amazing changes that go on with the growth of the fetus inside the mother's womb. In the book, you can see some of the main developmental aspects or checkpoints as the baby is growing. And we're not going to go through all these, but this is interesting to read. So you have the 8 weeks that tells what's going on, 8 to 12 weeks, what's going on in that area, etc., etc. And so, if you're interested, go in your book and you can look at these the stages and see when different parts of the embryo are produced. So the pregnancy is going on at this point, and now let's look at exactly what's happening in the pregnancy. We're going to move away from the fetus now and look more a little bit about the mom. So there's a lot of anatomical changes that happen during pregnancy, as well as physiological changes. So anatomical changes, the uterus is growing immensely. So this is a pretty amazing organ. It starts about the size of a grapefruit or an orange inside the mother, but by the time the 9-month pregnancy is over, that uterus is extended to fill up basically the whole abdominal cavity. All the organs have been displaced. This is going to and the center of gravity of the mother is going to change. It can cause a change in the back, the lumbar curvature in the back, and lead to back pain. There's going to be some relaxation of the pelvic ligaments and pubic symphysis in order to get ready for childbirth, and so the mother may feel like she has to kind of waddle around almost as the changes in her body happen. Physiological changes, the gastrointestinal system, there's morning sickness that happens, heartburn as well, because as that uterus is expanding, all the organs in the digestive system or that are normally in the abdomen are going to get displaced, and so you're going to have your digestive system is going to function just a little bit differently during the pregnancy. The urinary system as well. The kidneys are working for two, basically. You're still filtering all the blood for the mother, but now you're also receiving waste from the placenta, from the growing fetus, the embryo, and so you have to produce more urine. The mother produces more urine in order to compensate for that. And then also, as uterus expands, the bladder's not going to be able to have as much room to get bigger, and so the mother's going to have to go to the feel like she has to relieve her bladder more often. There's respiratory system changes. Again, putting some stress on the respiratory system as the other organs are getting displaced. During the later weeks, you may have trouble breathing. Cardiovascular system. The blood volume increases by 25 to 40%. Blood pressure and pulse increase, and you can form varicose veins as well. So these are pretty drastic changes that are going on in the mother as the fetus is growing. For those females that have been pregnant, I'm sure you've experienced one, if not all of those effects of having a growing baby and a growing fetus inside your womb. Then finally there's the childbirth, and we call this parturition, the actual moving the child through the birth canal and out, being born. So this is called labor. This is an involuntary action, involuntary rhythmic muscular contractions of the uterus to expel the baby from the womb. There's false labor, Braxton Hicks contractions, which are not, they are uterine contractions, but they're not strong contractions that are going to push the baby, remove the baby from the mother's womb. Initiation of labor is caused by rises in estrogen, and then that's going to cause uterine contraction. Uterine contraction is interesting because it is one of the few positive feedback situations inside our body. So we've talked a lot about negative feedback, which is like a thermostat. You have some balanced level, and as the body changes from that level, like a thermostat, it'll either kick on the heater or the air conditioner to bring you back to that level, and then it's going to turn off. In a positive feedback, though, as something begins, it's going to feed on itself, so it's going to grow stronger, stronger, stronger. Uterine contractions are like this. So in other words, the more the uterine contracts, the more it's going to contract. It's going to keep adding on each other, adding and becoming stronger and stronger, and happening more and more until the baby is expelled, and then the whole thing will shut off. So it can be a very dangerous type of feedback mechanism, because it'll keep growing and growing until the end goal is met. So as long as the baby is released, it's okay. But if it isn't released, it can really fatigue the mom. It can be very dangerous if everything doesn't go correctly. Oxytocin is released by the pituitary gland to prepare, and it's going to continue the contractions in this way. There are 3 stages of labor. The first one is called dilation. In the dilation, the cervix becomes dilated. So full dilation of the cervix is about 10 centimeters, and during this stage of labor, the uterine contractions begin and start to increase. The cervix softens and effaces, is what we call, which means that it thins, and the amnion ruptures, and that is often referred to as breaking the water. So the amnion has formed this protective barrier, the amniotic sac around the infant, around the fetus as it's been developing, and that breaks and is released through the vagina. This is the longest stage. It can last anywhere between 6 to 12 hours of the labor. You see the baby here and getting ready, moving down into the birth canal. Next we have the expulsion. Expulsion, the infant passes through the cervix and the vagina, and is actually comes out of the mother's body. This can last as long as 2 hours, but typically it's around 50 minutes in the first birth, and maybe as little as 20 minutes in subsequent births. And normal delivery is head first, and that's how you want the baby to be born. And if it's backwards, if the the rear end is coming first, and they call that a breech position. So here's our expulsion happening. The largest part of the baby, the largest diameter of the baby, is the head. So once that head comes through, then the rest of the labor goes pretty easily. The shoulders are a little tough, but the head is the main part. And then finally we have the placental stage, and this is where the placenta is delivered after the baby has been delivered. Usually happens about 15 minutes after birth. It happens as the uterus starts contracting, continues to contract to move back to its previous size. It doesn't quite get there immediately, but it's going to continue to contract and shorten. And as this happens, the placenta is going to detach from the uterine wall, and it's going to be delivered as well. And this is called the afterbirth. So, all right, so that's how pregnancy and delivery, labor, are going to happen. Those are the different stages. And last thing to mention here is the developmental aspects of the reproductive system. As you know, and as we've talked a little bit before, males have an XY system and females have an XX system. So your gender is determined depending on the chromosomes that you receive from your mother and father. So if both mom and dad give you an X chromosome, then you are a female. If you get an X from mom and a Y from dad, so the Y chromosome always is given by dad, then the baby's going to be a male. The gonads don't begin to form until the 8th week, so you can't tell the gender of the baby before that 8th weeks. And this is kind of maybe a weird way to say this, but the default gender is female. So if there isn't any testosterone produced, then that baby is going to develop as female. So for example, even if you have a baby that has an X and a Y chromosome, without the initiation of testosterone production being released, that baby would become a female. But as the testosterone is released and starts moving through the blood of the baby, that's what's going to cause the development of a male. Reproductive organs don't become functional until puberty, and that usually begins between ages 10 to 15, depending on the gender. Generally, females are going to go through puberty earlier than males. And then from puberty until in females menopause happens, a female is going to release an egg every month unless she's pregnant or there's something else going on. Menopause happens usually in the 40s, and what menopause is when you have a whole year that's passed without a menstruation. And basically the ovaries stop functioning, stop releasing eggs. Childbearing is not a possibility after that point. There's no menopause in males, so males continue to produce sperm throughout their lives, but as they get older, they're going to have a decline in testosterone and may have a decline in the number of sperm that are produced as well. So that is the reproductive system and how this system works.